So this week we've been talking about development, Caribbean development, and specifically the factors that promote or hinder um, Caribbean development in general, but applied to the Caribbean. Last time we talked about class boundaries and social class in general, government policies and the way that they can hinder it, as well as what's the fourth one? Right, natural and man-made disasters. We are moving on to technology. So, um, there are a few key points in this section. One is that due to the advent of globalization, technology has become much more widespread in all aspects of daily life. Um, and not just technology, but a more uh, the sharing of technology among peoples has become a lot more common, a lot more ubiquitous, a lot easier. For example, um, let's say the Romans and the Mayans both would have invented systems for transporting small amounts of water. So it's basically like the earliest form of plumbing. It's not actual pipes, it's gravity. They call them aqueducts. And they would have been developed independently in both the Maya civilization and the Roman civilization, and on probably a lot of others around the world. But for example, while the Mayans may have had these aqueduct systems, you know, rudimentary plumbing. The Aztecs and the Incas may not have. While the Romans might have had it, it probably may not have um, been spread to China or India because back in the day, prior to the technological ability for globalization to actually take hold, the process of sharing technology among and between peoples who developed it was a lot. It was not impossible by any means, and technology was shared among peoples all over the world, whether intentionally or consensually, or by force and in a very harmful, destructive way. But nowadays, and I guess you could say that it is kind of a cycle that just perpetuates itself because one of the things that allows for globalization to be as prominent and as widespread as it is the actual technology of nowadays. And we will get to that in the section that is dedicated to globalization. But for now, just know that one of the main things that has led to the um, modern, I guess you could say, technological scene, um, the modern landscape or environment of people using technologies is globalization. Technology is not just computers or machines that you can turn on and they do a thing and then you turn them off. Technology is anything, really. Like the aqueducts I was talking about earlier, that's a technology. Um, the way that you harvest um, your crops is a farming technology. The way that you pick cotton is textile technology. The way that having the fact that we have buttons and zips and Velcro and shoelaces, those are all different kinds of clothing technology. Technology is just any systematic way of using our resources that we develop or incidentally discover. Um, and technology is very, very interesting as a topic, but right now we're just going to talk about the way that it promotes and hinders development. So, next main point, technology can promote development, such as in the area of healthcare. It's important in production processes, such as, for example, in Guyana in the rice industry, like I was talking about, agricultural technology. Um, Something as simple as the machine that you use to pick your um, so anything from like the machine that you use to pick the crops or harvest the crops to just the way in which you dig your irrigation trenches. That's all of that is technology. And the other point here is that technology may contribute to the high levels of unemployment when human beings are replaced by machinery. And that will probably be a theme when we talk about the hindrances to development that technology provides. But for now, we're going to talk first about the benefits. So, list of benefits. First, quicker communication. Globalization is not just about technology and economics and whatnot. It's also about culture and communication. And one of the things that has allowed for cultural globalization, even um, like when globalization first started, it was not all cultural globalization. It was just facilitated by the ease of travel between nations. The airplane was invented long before, let's say, WhatsApp or Discord, even. Um, and so globalization, there are different kinds of globalization and they happened at different times. It's not just all one big balloon that bursts and suddenly we have globalization. Um, and so one of the things that different kinds of technology do is that they lead to quicker communication. Now, before that might have meant we have faster ways of getting to people, and because we have faster ways of getting to people or getting things to other people in other places, further places, we can communicate faster. But technology is also about changing the way that we communicate. So instead of writing a letter and sending it on a horse, and then the technological development is writing a letter and sending it via a man with a truck or a motorcycle, and then the technological development from that is writing a letter and putting it in a box and sending it on an airplane to someone across the Atlantic Ocean. That's a type of technological development that influences communication. But the other type is just instead of writing a letter altogether and sending it, a physical letter, we write a message online and we send that. It's quicker and more widespread communication. It's a lot further. The quicker communication gets, the more people from further, more distant, more remote, more separated places will be able to and will tend to communicate with one another. Um, right, quicker transactions, similar concept really. It's kind of just an extension of the quicker communications point, because a transaction is just a communication with some resources, whether it's money or things that are being traded or services even. Um, the same technology that facilitates quicker communication, um, that same technological advancement also facilitates quicker transaction between peoples. All right. Advancements in medical care. Obviously, this is a very big and very important point. Um, you know, for things like there's a medical concept known as trepanation, where back in the day, people used to think that mental disorders were a result of intracranial pressure, which is just pressure inside of the skull, whether that was from extra fluid or extra gas or whatever they thought was the cause. The solution was open a hole in their skull and let out the pressure, and that will cure their mental disorder. Obviously, that was wrong, but um, trepanation, the practice of trepanation has survived today. Um, for it's not, as drastic, you might say, as cutting out like a square of someone's skull, but it is still used when, for example, someone has bleeding in their brain or some sort of fluid building up in their skull that is damaging their brain or their other cranial faculties. You drill a hole in their head and let out whatever it is that is causing the issue. That's a development of technology. It's been made safer, it's been made more controlled, it's been made more sterile, um, and that is one of the many, many ways, obviously you can think of others, that technology leads to advancements in medical care. And remember, all of these are about um, the ways that technology um, promotes or benefits development. And so all of these have to be applied to the development of, well, any society really, but in practice and in the course of this syllabus, we're talking about the Caribbean. And the last point for the benefits is the efficient operation and management of business. Um, So it's a similar point again in terms of the scope that it covers to the point about quicker transactions. But this is more about, it's not just about what you can actually do or how you can actually trade or buy or sell. It's also about the operation and management of business, which is very, very important. And interestingly, just as an example of this, um, this is just to demonstrate the point, and hopefully you understand it a bit more clearly, a bit more realistically. Um, there's this concept in software engineering called the software crisis. And it's the idea that as the tools that people, like programmers, for example, were using to develop software, um, increased in their power and in the scope and the scale of things that they were able to do, um, the practices that had developed for developing software, a lone programmer sitting in a room typing some code into a computer, their testing method, their error handling, and all of that was quite slow. Um, it was, it was chaotic. It was unstructured in its nature, and so as the technology gave us the ability to do more and more things with more and more powerful technology, what happened was these methods that had developed, they did not um, advance um, alongside it. And so we had massive projects and projects that were just being like ordered bigger and bigger. The clients were demanding bigger and bigger and better technologies, and they weren't impossible to make. We had the resources, we had the tools, we had um, all the mechanisms that we needed to develop these larger, more powerful technologies, software specifically. But the practices that were being used to develop the actual software were not suited to the massive scale that was being demanded of by the progress of clients' demands and the progress of the actual computing power of the hardware. And so, what developed from that was the concept of software engineering, which is not so much, it's both about the processes of managing the team and the people who are developing the software, but it's also about managing the development of the actual software product. And so it's and that is something that, especially nowadays, is facilitated more so by technology than by human intervention and ingenuity, because once they actually came up with the way to design and manage and develop software projects in a way that was sustainable and actually doable, um, then we kind of got around to developing what are called case tools or computer assisted software engineering. And so that's just an example of how technology makes the efficient operation and management of business, in this case, the management of the actual projects and the process of developing the things that the business trades in, um, are benefited and improved and enhanced by the developments of technology, and how that, of course, leads to the development of society, because the software crisis was something that was on the minds of people in the 60s, mid 60s, let's say, and the development of this concept of software engineering was what allowed these bigger and bigger projects to be developed. And in 1969, human beings set foot on the moon for the first time. Um, and that is just, again, one of the most drastic examples of how technology leading to more efficient operation and management of business benefits development. Now we're going to talk about the hindrances of technology to development. First point, pretty obvious point, it reduces the need of manual labor. Um, so, for example, and this is not just like modern technology, it's not just industrialization and digital and information age technology, it's all technology. If the Mayans invent a system and a technology that can transport water straight from the Rio Grande or the whichever river um, runs through their city into straight into your house or straight into the um, city square or the bathhouse or wherever you need the water, that reduces the need for people to go to the wells where the water is just sitting there, not moving from the river into your house, and actually draw the water from the wells. Similarly, when, let's say, people would have been walking long distances with lots of packages and parcels and so on in a caravan, which is basically just people picking up the things that they need to live and moving with them, living on the way. Um, that would have changed with the development of the technology of animal caravans, like camels, for example. Camels are not necessarily technology, but the use of camels to make carrying lots of things long distances for long periods of time and having to live on the way as you do it um, easier and more accessible for people in particularly hostile climates like the deserts or the wilderness, Saharan or sub-Saharan wilderness, or for example the Arabian Peninsula. The process of using camels in caravans, that is a technology. A camel caravan is a technology, and that it reduces the need of manual labor, because before you may have had someone on that trip whose job it was simply to carry things, and of course they would have also had to carry the things that were needed for them to live as well as for other people to live. But the more people you got to do that, the easier that became. But those people would have become less and less necessary when you had these massive pack animals that were great at surviving any condition and were also great at carrying large loads. It reduces the need of manual labor, and obviously that continues into the modern day. The Industrial Revolution um, made factories a lot more automated, and so it's not that machines take away people's jobs necessarily. It is that the use of machines makes it so that you need a smaller number of people to operate the same amount of production, or to produce the same amount of the product or the service. And so that then leads to, it does end up with people's jobs being taken by the machines essentially, but it's not because the machines are taking the jobs away from the humans. It's just that the machines are making it so that a lot less humans are required to do the same work. And that is essentially how the Industrial Revolution works, and how industrialization in general reduces the need for manual human labor. The next point for the hindrances of technology to development is that um, small businesses shutting down due to competition is not particularly great for development. And that's basically, you might call it an economy of scale thing, um, where, and it's not really due to competition, it's due to um, eliminative or what is it, uncompetitive practices. That's what a lot of big, um, monopolistic conglomerate companies get sued for, or legally challenged for. It's uncompetitive practices, where you use your technological edge, um, or simply the fact that your technology allows you to work at a scale that your competitors cannot, to undercut and put them out of business, and then basically just raise the prices again because you now have monopolistic control over that market. But that's the idea. Um, Small businesses shutting down due to the competition. The competition is exacerbated and made, what you might say, unorganically one-sided by um, particular advances in technology, especially when that technology, rather than being shared throughout a society or throughout a community, is kept secret and used to gain a competitive edge, and so decrease the distribution of production in a community. And again, we come back to the means of production. A lot of this is going to be about the means of production. Marx never really goes away when you're studying society, or especially Caribbean society. So it's all about the means of production, and what technology does is it facilitates for a much more concentrated means of production than, well, basically, more advanced technology allows for a more concentrated means of production. Um, and it doesn't have to be that way. It's not inevitable. It's just that in a society where everyone is motivated by, you know, increasing capital, they say the love of money is the root of all evil. And so when you have a society where that is the case, and the motivation is um, for simply increasing capital, nothing else matters, or everything else is secondary to it, um, and everything is designed around increasing capital, getting me more money, um, then technology leads to the centralization or constriction or monopolization of the means of production. And that's bad for small business, it's bad for competition, it's bad for a diverse and vibrant economy. Next point. Um, this point here is listed as a culture of laziness and dependency. And the point here is basically that as we develop technologies that make things that we would have had to do before um, a lot easier to do, or require a lot less of our effort, or require a lot less of our time, or a lot less actual human beings, for example. So keeping a house warm in a temperate climate, for example, when it gets winter and it's really too cold to live outside and you need um, a fire or you will not survive the winter. That used to be the job of the entire community. Um, Getting firewood, starting fires, keeping the community warm was a job that was shared among the entire community. Technological advancements, not just the fact that like the resources that you use for your fires might be different. So a society that burns wood versus a society that burns coal will have very different um, like will have a very different work ethic around keeping the society warm because coal burns. It's a more dense, more efficient fuel than wood, and that's the general idea behind that. Technologies, more advanced technologies, make it easier um, or cheaper to do things, and so you might say that that creates a culture of laziness and dependency. Um, because I doubt that any of us who grew up in the way that we did would think about going out of your house on a morning to fetch water. Anytime that you need water, somebody has to go out to where the water is and fetch it, rather than it is constantly being supplied directly to you, and all you have to do is turn on the thing that lets it into your house and through your tap and into your glass. Um, and that is the general idea of this point. Again, I have to stress that I'm not telling you this is what you should think, this is objectively right or objectively wrong. I'm not preaching to you or anything. I'm just introducing you to all of these schools of thought so that when the exam comes and you have to write an essay on a topic, um, you are prepared to express and comment on and analyze and utilize all these different schools of thought in your writing. Last point under the hindrances of technology to development sorry, is the disruption of businesses um, when, for example, internet access is low. So the more your society, your economy, your businesses rely on certain kinds of technologies, especially when they're very, very centralized, um, you know, and they take a lot less people to actually do the job of supplying those technologies to this community or the society. What happens is, you know, Barbados Light and Power, um, when something goes wrong at the headquarters of Barbados Light and Power, Barbados, the whole island, just doesn't have electricity. And that can stop everything that is dependent on electricity. And so the more things are dependent on electricity, like for example, the water, the water pumping is powered by electricity. And so even the water is dependent on the electricity being on. And so if you don't have electricity, then the water station can't pump the water. You don't have internet. You don't have lights. Not that we need it in the Caribbean, but you don't have heat during the winter. Um, and so it the point is listed here as a disruption to business due to low internet access, but this point can be expanded to single points of failure, or at least a reduction in the points of failure, both the quantity and the size of points of failure of systems that and infrastructures that make up a society. And that really is the problem. That's why it's a hindrance to development, because the less or the smaller a point of failure is in the infrastructure that allows your society to operate, the greater the chances, obviously, something goes wrong in this one tiny place, and it has more ability, more influence on the rest of the society and the rest of the infrastructure and the technology that allows that society to run. So, any questions on that section on technology? Anything you don't understand? Anything at all? Okay. If everything is clear, there are no questions, we'll move on to the next topic, where we talk about global factors that promote or hinder development. The main idea of this section is that the global factors which affect development include, but are not limited to, things like war and insurrection and terrorism, natural disasters that affect production, um, uh, droughts or any kind of dearth in resources that affect the prices of commodities, diseases, genetically modified foods, and so on and so on. There are many global factors that influence development. The example that I like to give is how um, food standards in the United States of America, which is a country so large that it just does not make sense for Caribbean countries. I mean, strictly economically, of course. If you ascribe to a purely economic, financial, and specifically capitalist view of um, food production, the United States of America is such a large country that it would not make economic sense for Caribbean countries to grow and supply 100% of their own food. Because even if you planted as much of the Caribbean islands with, let's say, potatoes as you could, um, the United States of America would be able to plant with potatoes more land than the entire land area of the islands put together. And so they will always be able to sell us potatoes for cheaper than we can grow them for ourselves. And so if you're going strictly economically, and that's the only lens about which you're thinking about food production, then, and that's the economy of scale that I was talking about, the United States of America just being so much larger than, let's say, any of the Caribbean countries, can produce so much that they can, if we allow them to, monopolize, hegemonize, dominate, um, take over, undercut, and then own our economy simply by having so much more than we have. Um, okay, so the key points in this section. Major global issues can influence the economic, political, social, and environmental dimensions of individual countries. Um, there is this there's this concept known as PESTLE factors, PESTLE, PESTLE factors. So PESTLE stands for, the P is for political, the first E is for economic, the S is for social, the T is for technological, the L is for legal, and the second E is for environmental. And that's basically the way in which those are the six lenses that you have to look at, like any kind of sociological topic like this through. And so when you're talking about the effect that global factors have on the development of the Caribbean, you can look at it through all of those PESTLE factors: political, economic, social, technological, legal, and environmental. Okay, next up. Things like oil prices, for example, are influenced by disruptions in the Middle East, where a lot of the oil that we use is, you can't say really produced because oil isn't being produced, but where it is um, sourced from, where it is gotten. And so any, like, for example, civil, military, social disruptions in that area, in the Middle East, in the Arabian Peninsula, in Egypt, in Asia Minor, would have disruptions on the global oil market. And so the prices of products related to oil rise everywhere in the world. we live on a small island, comparatively speaking, and we have no dog in that fight. We are so far removed from it, but because of globalization, because of how much of the global oil market is so closely and inextricably linked and dependent on what is going on in the Arabian Peninsula and Egypt and the Asian Minor, that area known as the Middle East, um, then it creates a problem. It's again about the concentration of points of failure. Um, so if you would say that the Arabian Peninsula is the single point of failure for the global oil market, then yeah, that gives you a good illustration of the problem. Or for example, um, let's think of something else. The spice market um, was at one point in history pretty much limited to the Indian subcontinent. Of course, other places had spices, but India famously the climatic conditions in India and the geographic and geological and ecological conditions in the Indian subcontinent are famously such that any plant that can be grown on planet Earth can be grown in the Indian subcontinent. And so, for a long time in history, the Indian subcontinent was the world place for spices. Again, other cultures had them, but not the way India had them. And so the Indian subcontinent was, you might say, the single point of failure for the global spice market. Once the spice market became so globalized, once Europeans decided that instead of just, eating spices that grow indigenously to Europe, we're trying to cross pollinate, cross germinate, introduce some spices from somewhere else to Europe and have our own local domestic spice market. We're going to have a spice market based on trade with the place where these particular spices are growing. The Indian subcontinent, at least for let's say the Silk Road or the trading bloc of the time, you might call it a trading bloc, but it's really just imperialist guns and um, military power forcing other countries to do business with them, um, was they had a single point of failure on the Indian subcontinent. Um, and so that is one of the problems that globalization and global factors generally um, pose to development. Because this section is not so much about how globalization itself is bad for development, but it's about um, I guess last week we talked about disasters versus hazards, where a hazard is, the conditions for a disaster to happen, and the disaster is a realization of a hazard. You might think of globalization, in this case at least, as the hazard. So everybody in the world is eating coffee that is grown in, let's say, South America. The disaster, the realization of that hazard, then, is the global factor that hinders development, where something happens in South America and the coffee supply is cut short, and now we no longer have coffee anywhere else in the world. Third point is actually about natural disasters, diseases, and terrorism. They affect and destroy human life, um, and also other parts of society, infrastructure, the communities in general, on quite a large scale. Um, and this is kind of an apt topic to be teaching now because we are in the middle of a pandemic, global disease, natural disasters. We witnessed firsthand in Barbados at least how a volcano erupting in St. Vincent blanketed our own island in ash and blocked out our sun for a few days. Um, and that's a small scale example of it, but it is a very real example of it. Things like terrorism in certain parts of the world have effects long and far outside of the individual places where acts of terror occur because of the increasing interconnectedness and interdependence of the various different societies and communities around the globe. So that is the global factors and their contribution to promoting or hindering development. Any questions on that section? It was a short one.
No, sir, it was clear.
All right. In that case, moving on to tourism. I have a lot of thoughts. I will try not to insert my personal comments too much into the um, lesson on tourism and its impact on development. This will probably be this will probably take us straight up to the hour, 4 o'clock if you're in the Eastern Caribbean, or 3 o'clock if you're in Jamaica or the Greater Antilles. So, tourism. The main idea here is that tourism has significantly contributed to the development of the Caribbean region. No surprise. The Caribbean is one of the most popular tourist destinations in the world. Um, okay, so there's a term here that is quite important when you're talking about the tourism um, industry, and it will be, if you show this your knowledge of this term on an essay, you are likely to get a mark for this. It's called gastronomy. Gastronomy. Gastronomy, gastronomy, which is the art of choosing, cooking, and tasting good or palatable or tasty food. And that is a very large part of tourism. Okay, so let's get on to the key points in this section. Tourism is a major revenue earner for small island developing states. This is not unique to the Caribbean. Most small island developing states, what happens is the less potential a place has for industrialization, um, that means that it also has a lot less potential for a lot of other developmental um, aspects, the same way that I talked about the economy of scale thing earlier, where even if we planted all of the ground that we could in the Caribbean with potatoes, because the United States of America is just so much larger, they could easily outplant us many times over. They could plant areas equivalent to and many times greater than the entire land areas of our whole islands. And so that economy of scale thing leads to the large countries with lots of industrializing potential, developing in that regard, and small small islands is a great example of a place where the natural resources and potential for industrialization and um, technological development are so very limited that what ends up being their main revenue earner is tourism. Because if a place does not, and this is just a general rule of thumb for development in sociology across the globe and across the spectrum. If a place does not have a high potential for industrialization and economic material development, the way that places like the U.S., China, India, the Europe do, those are large land-connected countries. Um, Places like small islands, um, being on the opposite end of that spectrum, their value to a market, globalized capitalist market, tends to be in tourism, because, and it's not that the larger landlocked countries don't have tourism markets as well, they do, but the unique appeal of small and developing states as being places where people who come from large landlocked industrialized places, they don't get to experience a lot of the things that make islands unique geologically and demographically and geographically and so on. And so our value to places like the US and the UK and Europe and China and India becomes something like tourism. It's also that, small islands tend to be, small tropical islands. There are lots of small islands in the North American continent. The Aleutian Islands are islands between um, Alaska and Russia, but they are very, very cold and they are very dark a lot of the year, and they do not have the same appeal to people who live in, temperate climates as a tropical island does. And so the unique geography, geology, ecology, social demography, and so on of just the concept of a small island makes them particularly valuable to other large developed nations for tourism. That is the value that they see in these islands. And so it is a major revenue earner for not just Caribbean states, but small island developing states in general. That acronym SIDS or SIDS is one that will become quite important as you study Caribbean studies. Okay, tourism contributes to the development of the Caribbean in social, political, economical, and environmental ways, and not all of those contributions are positive. Um, so, it's just a quick list of contributions that tourism makes to the region. We have employment. Obviously, like in Barbados, for example. I recently heard a news report that said that tourism was responsible for, I think it was a third of the island's employment and 2/5 of the island's revenue. So a third of the people in Barbados work directly or indirectly in the tourism industry, and tourism generates 40%, 2/5 of the revenue of the island. And that is what you might call a monoculture, economically speaking. For those of you who do not know or were not here when we were talking about the history of the Caribbean, monoculture is an economic principle by which your entire economy is powered by or fueled by the revenue generated by one industry or one like source of revenue. In the past, agricultural monoculture drove the soil quality down. It made economic development and diversification hard, and it led to the Europeans um, destroying and severely underdeveloping the Caribbean and the Americas in general for centuries. And it's not unique to the Caribbean either. It's just a feature of European colonialism and imperialism. But when Caribbean people, or the Caribbean people who were formerly the oppressed class, um, became the um, basically gained autonomy and self-governance and were now able to make their own decisions for themselves. What ended up happening in a lot of Caribbean islands, territories, is that they replaced one monoculture with another. Um, they did not, it seems, learn the lessons that the Europeans honestly should have learned, but it's not even so sure if they learned them about monoculture and the damage that that does to an economy. I like to say in Barbados, sugar was king, and sugar took us into the 20th century and almost into the 21st century, and then sugar died, and the king is dead long with the king. Tourism came, and we replaced sugar with tourism. It is, economically speaking, identical in that it is not something that directly benefits us. It only benefits us in the revenue that it gets us. And it is a renewable resource, but one that depletes other resources around it in the process of being produced. And it is the scale that is required for it to work in its current form leads almost inevitably, under mismanagement and a lack of sustainable thinking and development, to a monoculture, which does some serious economic damage. So that's employment. And maybe we did get a little bit off track there, but these are the kind of ideas that a good Caribbean studies essay are built on. Things like supplies for cruise ships, sports tourism, ecotourism, leisure tourism, and political and social affiliations. Um, like the Caribbean Tourism Organization, as well as lots and lots and lots of foreign exchange, which you hear governments in the Caribbean talking about a lot more than governments in other parts of the world, because we are so we are such tourism based and tourism driven economies. Okay, the main idea of this point is that there must be an assessment of the instances when tourism has had a negative influence on the region, and that is basically the only way that the Caribbean will ever recover, and as I like to phrase it, get out of the tourism hole. And a lot of the talk and a lot of the development in the region is going in the direction of digging us deeper into the tourism hole. As much as they talk about supporting local farming and agriculture and manufacturing and um, all these kinds of industries that most peoples in the world and most societies in the world untouched by and unburdened by colonialism and underdevelopment, tend to develop for themselves before attempting to offer value to the rest of the world, we have put the cart very, very, very far ahead of the horse. Barbados offers tourism to millions of people from all over the world, but it does not grow enough food to feed itself. That kind of thing. Um, and so there must be an assessment when we're talking about development, because this is now the section on the challenges that tourism poses to development. When we're talking about the development of the Caribbean region, we have to talk about the ways that tourism has been harmful to development. The thing about tourism is that it is one of those industries where the harm that it does to the development of a nation is very hard to see, both because it is so far in the future and also because it's very hard to see past the piles and piles of money that it generates. And as much as that may sound like an aphorism or an indictment of the government, it is true. We get blinded by the massive potential revenue that tourism provides, and that then blinds us to the impact, the cost of tourism, the long-term cost, um, and especially the long-term costs to this thing that we keep talking about and you keep hearing about more and more recently, sustainability. Because ultimately, the way that the Caribbean is currently doing tourism is both not particularly great for its people, or its natural resources, or its environment or ecosystem, or society, or its future. And one of the reasons, one of the biggest reasons, is that it is not sustainable. Um, Basically, it runs in a way that it consumes more than it produces, or it takes more than it leaves or replenishes. And so eventually, if we keep going at the rate that we are going, and this is not just for tourism, this is for almost everything that the Western European industrialist culture of excess has influenced all over the world, thanks to globalization again. Um, that's something we experience in almost every aspect of society and life, but really and truly, it is possibly the most important thing that you will ever have to deal with, um, and it will be our problem to deal with as much as it was not the problem that we generated. It will be the problem that we have to deal with because no one else is going to do it for us. In the next 20, 30 years, we are going to be the ones um, with sustainability so hammered into us either by the conscious efforts of um, education and awareness campaigns or by the simple fact that we watched um, so many of the systems around us crumble and do serious long-term damage, and we were actually witnesses of that damage because sustainability was not at the forefront of the minds of the people who developed and implemented such systems in the past. So tourism may pose challenges to local society where foreign cultures and lifestyles clash with it. Um, A common one that comes up as a joke a lot on social media is shoes inside the house. Um, and so you have, let's say, American tourists who, as part of their culture, do not take their shoes off indoors. Generally speaking, there are exceptions to every rule and subcultures within the United States of America. It's a very large and very diverse country, but generally speaking, um, significantly more Americans than in the rest of the world do not take their shoes off indoors. That's just not a cultural practice. In Caribbean countries and in most of the rest of the world, it is just standard practice. It is baked into culture. Of course, shoes are for outside. When you're inside, you don't wear the shoes. And so those cultures may clash. A Caribbean hospitality industry, sure, you may have like hotels and such, which are not so much dependent on the individual cultural aspects of Caribbean people, and so not dependent on Caribbean individual hospitality, but rather on a mass produced um, pseudo Caribbean hospitality industry, um, which is more about the international brands setting up hotels in the Caribbean islands than actual Caribbean people and their own cultural expressions of hospitality. And so, sure, in the hotels, if they don't take their shoes off at home with them, they probably won't take them off in the hotels. But if they were ever to try to come to the Caribbean and live um, and experience the Caribbean as the Caribbean with the Caribbean people, the Caribbean culture, that might be a legitimate culture clash. That might be a legitimate issue for tourism. Again, it's a small example, but it is just to be used as a demonstration of the concept. A lot of cultural clashes can arise when, for example, tourists may have tried to climb the Great Pyramids at Giza, or they try to carve their initials into the Colosseum at Rome, um, or they may want to. Well, there are a lot of examples, and I'm sure you can come up with your own on an essay. But the point is, culture clash is a big societal strain that tourism puts on a community. Next point, environment. The environment may come under threat. For example, when hotels are constructed so close to the shore, or when yachts and ocean liners dump oil and sewage directly into the ocean. We experience the effects of this firsthand, living on small islands with lots of hotels. The west coast of Barbados is basically all the tourism sector, the tourism industry. The entire west coast is just taken up by the tourism industry, um, not the fisheries industry as it used to be, the tourism industry. And sure, Barbados is different because historically it has been used as a port by the European colonialists. But still, so much of the land in the Caribbean that is like close to beaches, for example, is used up by the tourism sector and the tourism industry. That the things like coral reefs, the sand on the actual beaches, the general geological, geographical, and ecological sustainability of the Caribbean's beaches. And again, it's a very long term thing. It's hard to see as you're doing it, but it becomes very clear in the future. It's under threat because of um, hotels and the general tenets of the tourism industry. Yachts and ocean liners dumping oil and human sewage into the ocean. You have these massive, massive cruise ships coming through, um, not just unintentionally destroying coral reefs, um, just like by physically bumping into them and destroying them, ripping them out of the ocean floor, but also by, there's thousands of people on this cruise ship. They all go to the bathroom, and all of that gets dumped out straight into our oceans um, all at once. And the effect that dumping the human sewage of several thousands of people on a cruise ship into our marine ecosystems has on our environmental safety and well-being. I don't have to spell it out for you. It's human sewage. Third point, the economy may become too dependent on tourism and therefore vulnerable to instability. Ta-da! Welcome to the COVID pandemic. Um, when international travel screeched to a halt, uh, a lot of Caribbean governments, but particularly Barbados, were scrambling and struggling. And Caribbean governments' decisions on COVID-19 have been, politically speaking, so motivated by the desires and the pressures of the places that supply our tourists that you used to joke about, let's say, two Barbadoses or two Caribbeans. One is for the tourists that come and one is for the people that live here. But the pandemic seems to have reduced that to one Caribbean, and it's not the one for the people who actually live here. The Caribbean is basically for the tourists and only for the tourists. And, if they bring whatever strain of COVID they bring to the Caribbean, that's just something that we have to deal with. They come and introduce diseases into our communities by going on irresponsible bus crawls, for example, or other means of, generating super spreaders that severely impact our population. That's just something we have to deal with. If they come here with their higher vaccination rates and interact with our communities with relatively lower vaccination rates, the virus that they may be asymptomatically carrying um, faces all the evolutionary pressure necessary to mutate and develop into new strains and variants. And that is just something that we have to deal with. Um, and of course, when you talk about tourism nowadays, using the pandemic as your example on your exam will be a relatively obvious choice, but it will be a very relevant choice, and you'll have to put a lot of thought into the way that you can apply what the syllabus teaches you about tourism to the current situation. Final point, and then we're done for the day. The role of the Caribbean Tourism Organization. The CTO's role is to market and manage the tourism industry in the region. Tourism is all about marketing and management, specifically marketing, because as nice as the Caribbean islands are, if me and my cold landlocked European country, I just don't know about them, then I'm never going to go there on vacation. And really, the onus is on us because we are the ones who are actually so dependent on this tourism to do all that marketing. And yes, a lot of the marketing actually gets done by word of mouth and by natural spread. I go for a vacation to a really nice place, and I tell my friends and encourage them to go for a really nice to the same really nice place for their vacation, and they spread it, and so on. And that happens, organically and mimetically, but it's still on the Caribbean islands to do a lot of that marketing, and that is a lot of what the tourism industry generally is about. And the Caribbean Tourism Organization takes it upon themselves, knowing the dependency of the region on tourism, to really put their organizational backing behind it so that it is as efficient and as effective as it possibly can be. So that's that section covered. Any questions on that? I know it's just a little bit past the hour, but if you have any questions, feel free to ask.
Sure, you could redefine cities.
Small island developing states,
Okay, yeah. What you mean again?
right? That's it. Small island developing states. Most small island nations in the world, because of their um, relatively to the larger countries, their limited natural resources have a much smaller potential or capacity for the kind of development that is valued by the larger countries. And so we get the label small island developing states because the economies of scale that allow the larger nations to develop um, so much faster or larger scales than we do um, leave us significantly behind. It's not just that, obviously, it's also the centuries of European colonialism. But all of those factors combine to give us the label small island developing states. And as I always say, the Caribbean Studies syllabus is not something that you will only learn in the classroom. Anything that you find particularly interesting or think that you might want to expand on in an essay in your exam, you have to go and research it and internalize that concept so that when you go in that exam, you are not trying to regurgitate from the syllabus, because the syllabus is so large that if you try to regurgitate, if you try to hold all that information in your head, you won't be able to do any other exam. You need to internalize these concepts so that when you are writing your essays, you are basically just talking about a thing that you know about. So yeah, you might want to research SIDS for yourself. It is very interesting, but specifically the sociopolitical and geographical factors that go into the phenomenon, you might say, of small island developing states.